Hello, this is Marilia, and I want to welcome you to Salto del Gato. This is my YouTube channel, and this is my Gumshoe series. And today I'm going to continue discussing the Stephen Smith case. This is the backstory. Now, this is a story of a young teenager named Stephen Smith. He is the victim of this crime and was only 19 years old at the time. He was still driving on a permit and had not yet upgraded to an unrestricted driver's license. Stephen was born to Sandy Smith and Joel Fred Smith on January 29th of 1996 in Lexington County, South Carolina. He was a twin, and his sister's name was Stephanie. He was a 2014 Wade Hampton High School graduate attending OC Technical College of Orangeburg and studying to become a registered nurse. Stephen died on the night of July 8, 2015, between 3 and 4 a.m. The case was classified as a hit and run and went cold, and now 8 years later, after much media attention, SLED claims that evidence uncovered during the Murdaugh family investigations has refocused their attention on Stephen's case and began investigating it as a homicide. Stephen was born into a family that had its share of struggles, trying to provide financially for a household of 5 children. Stephen was predeceased by his brother Joseph Smith, who passed away in infancy. I could not uncover much information about Joseph or most of Stephen's other siblings. Stephen's obituary lists his surviving siblings as brothers Christopher Smith and David Wingate, 2 sisters, Stephanie Smith and Melissa Smith, and several nieces and nephews, and of course his parents, Joel Fred Smith and Sandy Smith. Stephen's father died a few months after Stephen. He worked as a supervisor with the maintenance department at the South Carolina Highway Department in Hampton, South Carolina. His obituary notes his children as David Wingate of Estill, Christopher Smith of Bronson, Melissa Smith and Stephanie Smith of Bronson, and 5 grandchildren. He was predeceased by 2 sons, Joseph James Smith and Stephen Nicholas Smith. Stephen was an openly gay young man in a town where signs on backwood roads read "Repent or Perish." By most accounts, he was warm, engaging, funny, and well-liked, despite identifying as a homosexual in this conservative, small, less than 3,500 total population South Carolina town. This community was very much embedded with strong Christian values, and most folks were not very tolerant of differences in others. It was a type of community where a privileged class of predominantly white families from owed money with well-established political power ruled. There was them, and then there was everyone else. These privileged families' children grew up in early childhood environments surrounded by hunting, fishing, trapping, shooting, and having access to multiple residences. Access to guns and ammunition was common. We have learned from accounts relayed in various documentaries and podcasts that the youth were given much unsupervised free rein. They had access to operating motor vehicles and boats. It also appears that the consumption of alcohol in the presence of adults or where they were minors was commonplace. And I wonder if there were curfews. But this was not the world that Stephen was born or raised in. Stephen's family had only one home, not several. They lived in a trailer, not on large tracts of land. They were the ordinary folk, lifelong residents of the town. Good people. They could only imagine what it must be like to be one of the privileged. At the time of his death, Stephen lived at his father's house with his sister Stephanie and a brother. Stephen dreamed of escaping his humble beginnings and aspired to become a nurse as a stepping stone to becoming a doctor someday. Stephen wanted to climb up and experience a different quality of life. Life can be harsh, especially when you are at odds with the prevalent beliefs and values of the community. Finding employment in a small rural town or surrounding area can be challenging. The annual median income in this community was between $17,000 and $18,000. Stephen wanted to make extra money to help pay for his education. He turned to high-risk activities such as escort services to earn money and perhaps to find acceptance from like-minded people. Stephen's plight would have been more manageable in larger communities, but it was not easy in this low country of South Carolina. His sister said Stephen didn't have best friends. She was his best friend. Stephen was slow to trust people he didn't know. He didn't know who he could trust. She said Stephen never had a real relationship, and she didn't believe what Mark B., the man who claimed to be Stephen's boyfriend, said, especially about Stephen being involved with escort services. She denies that ever happened. However, in other interviews, she shared with the interviewer that Stephen showed her all the gay apps he was on. She advised him not to give them any personal information. Although Mark B. is a sketchy-sounding guy, I'll agree, but she admits that he was paying Stephen's car insurance and had given him a $200 gas card a couple of days prior. That is why it seems odd that he would have run out of gas. For me, this would be a he said, she said, except when David Yearn spoke up. Mr. Yearn says Stephen had been with him a few days prior from about 10 p.m. to 1 a.m. This man claimed he met Stephen through a Craigslist advertisement Stephen had placed. This tells me that Stephen was newly coming out on a certain level and was still trying to find a way to manage life as a young male homosexual. It seems he didn't share his private life details with family for whatever reason. He was exploring socializing in this gay environment and figuring out how to gain benefits and get through school. However, his sister and mother say his behavior had changed in the weeks leading to his death. He became secretive about where he was going and what he was doing. Sandy said he even cut class, which was very out of character. He had begun to spend time at Bobcat's Landing, which was rumored to be a gay hangout, and it had access to water for swimming. On a previous occasion, July 4th of 2015, he had gotten into an altercation and called one of his sisters to pick him up there. He had started going to his mother's house and hanging out there until 2 a.m., then headed out. Bobcat's Landing might have been a destination. It was not too far away. It answers the question of what Stephen was doing out on Sandy Run Road between 3 and 4 a.m. Stephanie said that in a phone conversation, he showed her his bare feet, which were wet and muddy. She asked him where he was, and he told her he was on campus. It was 2 a.m. She knew he wasn't on campus. Not at that hour, and she knew the campus was high and dry, but she didn't pry. Sandy noted that this new behavior seemed to kick in during the summer session. She said Stephen attended morning classes, which was an almost 2-hour commute, and on the day of his death, he came home from school, showered, dressed, and left. He didn't spend time studying or share where he was going or with whom. If he were at Bobcat's Landing, it would explain his wet and sandy shoes. In a court TV interview, Eric Bland said Stephen was supposed to go fishing in Florida the following weekend. She didn't know with whom. He seemed interested in someone and mentioned a 22-year-old he was attracted to. But Sandy said he had also told her he was seeing someone from a prominent family. The unnamed individual was hiding being gay, and that she would be shocked if he revealed the person. Stephen didn't make it to Florida. The Grizz linked the secret person and the Florida trip to the Murdaughs, but there is no definitive proof. He also mentioned a mysterious 22-year-old he had run into that he seemed interested in. On July 8th of 2015, a call came into the police reporting someone was lying in the middle of the road and that it might have been hit by a car. The caller said, "Yeah, someone is lying in the middle of the road and someone will hit him. I didn't move him or anything, but he will be hit. It's dark out here." The 911 operator assures the caller they'll get someone out there. The police arrived on the scene at approximately 4 a.m. in Bronson, South Carolina. There they discover Stephen's lifeless body lying on top of the yellow middle line on the road. Let's go to the crime scene. Stephen's body was lying on the top of the yellow center line in the middle of the road. His legs were bent at the knees to his left. His shoes were loosely tied and still on his feet. His right arm stuck out from his body and noticeably had blood all over it, towards the top of it especially. His left arm was lower on his side, and the bulk of the blood pattern from his head injury had pooled under his head and flowed to his right across the yellow line onto the other side of the road. It was a significant amount of blood. New sets of eyes reviewing this say the blood on his right arm only makes sense if either Stephen was still moving and had moved his arm or someone had moved and dropped him in this position. The amount of blood that flowed from under his head appeared to originate at the location it was found at. There also appeared to be a few blood stains on the road near his feet. Stephen's mother said the back of his head was crushed. His right eye socket was broken, and he had defensive wounds. His body was clothed, and his clothing was intact, besides several stains that appeared to be blood on his trouser shorts. The stains on the shorts' upper left side resemble 2 fingerprints, and the left leg of the trousers appears to show a blood transfer pattern. The shirt was a black Nike shirt with a white stripe on either side of the armpit area down to the bottom of the shirt. Stains along the collar and the area of the white stripes may also be blood stains and look inconsistent with the position his body was found in. The shoes were muddy, and footprints or tracks would have been on the road if he were walking on the paved road. In the lower tracks of the shoes, sand was visible. The tread is worn down, showing a wear pattern. They were blue with white trim. Yves Saint Laurent brand Van-style shoes. On the front of the white sole are a few reddish spots that could be blood from droplets that hit the ground, cast off the object it hits, and causes microscopic or satellite spatter. The other side shows that what can be additional blood transfer. This evidence was on Stephen's clothing. We don't know the chain of custody of the clothing and whether they can be retested. The blood on the front of the pants is not consistent with an automobile strike. It is more consistent with blood transfer and fingerprints. How did Stephen get here? What happened? Why was Stephen on this dark, desolate backwoods country road at 3 a.m.? Did his car run out of gas? Was he walking back to his home in the middle of this dark road? Why leave his wallet in the car? He had his cell phone in his pocket, so why not call someone for help? His body was 6.5 miles from his home. His mom says he would not walk alone in the dark at that time of night. She points out that he had his cell phone and questions why he wouldn't call his sister to come pick him up. Sandy says Stephen was skittish about making himself vulnerable. Stephanie said he would have called for help and hid in the woods till she came to pick him up. Sandy thinks he didn't get out of his car willingly. The injuries, let's go there. I will paraphrase how the first autopsy describes a series of injuries on Stephen's head. There is a 7.5-inch laceration to the head above the right eye and right temple area. A skull fracture began at the site of the laceration and cracked the entire right side of the skull along the right side to the occipital or back of the right side of the head. The inside of the skull shows at least 3 fractures to the basilar skull. This is the area inside the skull where the spinal cord attaches to the brain. See the image. Additionally, it shows that the area of that brain that makes up the midbrain was stretched by the force of the blow to his head. This injury is not survivable. Internally, there are several areas of significant injury to the brain, especially around the right temporal site. His body had 2 black eyes consistent with this type of brain injury. Stephen had aspirated blood in his lungs. This meant, at least for a short period, his body continued to breathe, although the impact on his head immediately incapacitated him. There was also a dislocated right shoulder and other bruising and scratches to his upper arms. The medical examiner said this was probably due to a vehicle-pedestrian collision, but there was no evidence of a vehicle being involved. The Grizz says it is consistent with someone beating him to death with an object such as a baseball bat. True crime sleuths point out it is consistent with a left-handed batter swinging up at Stephen and making contact with his head. They also note that Buster bats as a left-handed batter. How Stephen sustained these injuries will be better explained by the second autopsy. Until then, we are left to speculate amongst ourselves. However, I would be cautious and consider all that was taking place in Stephen's life, the people he was interacting with, and the life choices he was making for himself. I agree that it makes me wonder about Buster or other Murdaugh family members, even the older ones, and their interactions and connections to Stephen and his family. Unrelated to this, but interesting, is that his sister Stephanie winds up in a relationship with the sheriff and has a child with him. I also question why all the kids seem to live with their father, not Sandy. I have great admiration for Sandy. Her dedication and resilience is notable. I can't help but wonder what her life was like, married to Stephen's father and raising all the children. I believe she works or worked at a nearby convenience store. Was it finances or something else that split the family up? Where did the Mark B character come from? Was he trafficking Stephen? He is quoted as saying Stephen wasn't happy at home with his father because one of the sisters or their spouses was involved in drugs, and he avoided them. He was worried about his status at school, where he was drug tested frequently. Why was that? Was that part of the nursing program protocol? I have questions. The ending of Stephen's life is the beginning of our getting to know him. Now, 8 years later, pictures have surfaced on the internet showing the position of Stephen's body. However, in one image, his legs are bent at the knees, pointing to the right towards the center line. In the other, the bent knees are pointing to the left, away from the center line. Who moved them and why? Is this when they searched his pockets and found his phone and car keys? The images show he was lying on his back when he was found. The new sled theory is that a truck mirror hit him, but the evidence is not consistent with this theory. In the low country, there is a lot of pluff sand. There is also sand on the top of the shoes. Where could it have originated? Was he at Bobcat's Landing that day? Pluff or wet sand is common along the waterway areas of South Carolina. Where did Stephen's shoes come in contact with the water source? Also, how did Stephen sustain defensive wounds? There is no evidence of a vehicle being involved in Stephen's injuries. No scrape marks on Stephen's body other than a massive wound to the right side of his head. There were no tire tracks. The bloodstains or spatters are not consistent with a vehicle hit. No evidence that the body was dragged, tumbled, or moved by a vehicle impact. No damaged debris from a car mirror or other vehicle parts was found at the scene and surrounding areas. The traffic flow survey shows that the road is straight for miles in either direction, and traffic was light then. It would have been easy to see an oncoming car's headlight from either direction and plenty of time to move out of the way. Local police were the first on site. They looked at this and said, it's a victim on the road. Must be a hit and run, not our jurisdiction. Let's call the Highway Patrol. The Highway Patrol comes on the scene and says there is no evidence of a vehicle pedestrian hit and run. This is not our jurisdiction either. Someone says it's a gunshot. The body goes to the medical examiner, and another conflict emerges there. One of the detectives questions the medical examiner's autopsy results. The medical examiner gets snappy and tells the detective it's not her job to determine if it was a hit and run or a homicide. Another pathologist or coroner, I think it was an assistant coroner, who questions the autopsy, gets fired. The case gets transferred to SLED, and it gets code in their hands. Why? SLED did a bit of investigation, but made some critical or questionable choices. Many ask if these were mistakes or something more concerning like corruption. For example, they conducted interviews over the phone. Stephen's clothing in the custody of SLED, the chain of custody was broken. And they released the clothing to the funeral company and left them there unattended. What happened from there, I am not sure. Some statements say that SLED retrieved them from the funeral parlor, recognizing they might need the clothing in the future. Others say the funeral parlor released the clothes to Stephen's mother, who washed them. His car was photographed, and the investigators moved things around rather than photographing bagging and tagging. His wallet was in the car in an odd wedge position. Not clear if the investigators lifted it to ID the car owner and then replaced it. Stephen's phone was taken into custody, but SLED did not or could not crack the password to access the phone data. They stored it and it disappeared, then reappeared. Swabs of Stephen's genitals were never tested. It seems all the law enforcement agencies walked away saying, no hit and run, no gunshot, and they shrugged and let it all go silent. The death certificate listed the cause of death as undetermined, and the case was never formally closed. It became a cold case. The evidence is troubling. Not good. There is trouble here. These things now raise questions and make SLED's handling of this investigation look like a hot mess. What WTF is happening in South Carolina? Well, let's be real. This is probably happening worldwide, even in our own communities. We just point the finger at other communities and try to tell ourselves this would never happen in our community. Think about that. We're all waiting to hear the results of the second autopsy report. I'd like to see if markings on the body are consistent with post-mortem. We wait with Stephen's family for a second autopsy, hoping to change the death certificate to show the method of death. The issue is that this is now 8 years after the fact. The soft tissue is dissolved and consumed. Bones are left. What if the autopsy is inconclusive or remains the same? We have to prepare for the facts and proceed from there. Stephen can no longer share the story of who he was, nor show us a collection of everything he loved. His story is left to others to tell, but perhaps his body can add one more page to the mysterious story of his death. All we can do is try to bring answers to his family and reveal what really happened on that dark, lonely backwoods country road in South Carolina. Perhaps justice will prevail after all. Then there are the rumors. Let's go there. Let's go to the rumors. Stephen's mother never accepted the explanation for Stephen's death. In frustration over the apparent non-action SLED was taking in her son's untimely death, she wrote a letter to the FBI. It appears that in this letter she shares with them several accounts that describe how the Murdaughs inserted themselves in Stephen's death. She even shares how she drove to the crime scene and saw Randy and Alec Murdaugh there that morning. She didn't stop, but a few minutes later, she received a call from Randy Murdaugh saying he wished she'd stopped so he could have met her. The next morning, she and her husband entered the police station to identify the body. A call again came from the Murdaughs to Mr. Smith's cell phone, offering to act as a liaison between them and the investigators, pro bono. Some say this call came from Randolph Murdaugh III, handsome. That's Sandy's account. Others say it was Randy who called. This puzzled the Smiths, as they had no idea there were any questions about what happened to Stephen. At this point, the Smiths thought they would get answers from the local police. Sandy also relayed to the FBI all the rumors and told how several people had independently approached her or other family members and told them the Murdaugh boys caused Stephen's death. The Murdaughs placed themselves in the middle of this mess through their physical presence at the scene and the subsequent phone calls to the Smiths, which after a few calls between Mr. Smith and Randy stopped accepting their calls. This is according to Sandy Smith. Now, this makes me wonder why in the world members of the largest and most prominent law firm in town and of a family with over 80 years of holding the office of county solicitor, the Murdaughs had such an interest in the Stephen Smith case. Were they just genuinely interested in helping the Smith family? Out of character for them. Were they ambulance chasing for another lawsuit to handle? How did they hear about the incident? Why would they be alerted? At this point, they no longer were the county solicitors for this district. Alec was a volunteer solicitor, but not an official solicitor. However, did he still hold that much power over the law enforcement agencies that they would call him to alert him of random accidents? Is that a normal procedure? What are the connections between Murdaugh and Stephen and his family? Randy represented Joel Fred Smith, Stephen's father, in a previous unrelated insurance case. Randy also coached the Little League team Stephen and Buster were on. Buster and Stephen attended the same school, but were not in each other's social circles. Stephen's body was found in close proximity to the Moselle property. Let's talk about suspects. In 2015, 2 individuals were named. The report is included in the Hampton Police Department notes. The individuals named were Patrick Wilson and Sean Connolly. Who are they? Patrick Wilson and Sean Connolly were regulars at the Moselle drinking parties with Paul and Buster. Here is where it gets interesting. In 2015, shortly after Stephen Smith's death, Darrell Williams called the police and passed on the following story. Darrell said his stepson Patrick confessed to him that his buddy Sean Connolly was driving drunk in his truck and struck something on the road. The next day, Sean went by the road and saw a lot of police activity, so he later heard on the news that a body had been found. After confessing to his stepfather, Patrick went outside and vomited. This led Darrell to tell the police he suspected Patrick was with Sean when they hit something on the road that allegedly turned out to be Stephen. The police asked Darrell why he was coming forth now, and he said that Randy Murdaugh urged him to call in. Now, there you have it. 6.5 years later, in 12/20/21, this conversation would be revisited by the South Carolina Highway Patrol, but we'll get there. Continuing with the calls that came in back in 2015, another anonymous tip was called in on 12/7/2015 to the South Carolina Highway Patrol. It is included in the Mate death investigation report. It said that in Ontario, Aikens and 2 other men, a black male and a white male, were involved in the Stephen Smith death. The name Murdaugh was written in parentheses after the white male in the detective's notes. It did not state Buster Murdaugh, but because his name has come up over 40 times in this investigation, it was assumed that the report was referring to him. A local newspaper then wrote an article that a prominent family member might have been involved in the death of Stephen Smith. Shortly after this article, Randy Murdaugh, that's when he told Darrell Williams to go to the police with his story. Soon, other newspapers caught the story and ran with it. The report was taken and added to the file. Here's the history of Patrick Wilson and Sean Connolly. On April 17th of 2015, Patrick Wilson was charged with 3 counts of attempted murder for a road rage incident where he got into an argument with a driver of a car next to him, and Patrick pulled a gun and threatened the driver and his 2 passengers. He was released on bond. While he was out on bond, multiple harassment charges were filed against him because he was harassing the victims he had previously threatened and was out on bond for. Here is where it gets interesting. Corey Fleming represented Patrick Wilson. You remember Corey. He's Alex's man. Well, it turns out that after Darrell called the South Carolina Highway Patrol to report the conversation that Randy Murdaugh urged him to relay to the police, that Corey Fleming, representing Patrick Wilson, persuaded Solicitor Duffy Stone to drop all charges against Mr. Patrick Wilson. Bam! It was done. Is it only me who thinks this has the Murdaugh brand all over it? Remember that at the time of Stephen Smith's death, Patrick Wilson was out on a bond on 3 charges of attempted murder. Don't know. Corey Fleming also represented Connor Cook from the boat accident and the Satterfield brothers. Yep, that Corey Fleming. Once the charges are dropped, no further action was taken against Mr. Patrick Wilson. He was released. Patrick Wilson and Sean Connolly go on with their lives and move out of the area. They can't be located. The Stephen Smith case goes cold, and it would be 6.5 years later when Michael Duncan of the South Carolina Highway Patrol Mate Division called a gentleman named Nick Ginn, the Hampton Police Department. He was a police officer there. This is now December of 2021. Mr. Duncan asked Mr. Ginn to recall the conversation relayed to him by Mr. Darrell Williams. He does. Now, here's another quirk. Nick Ginn, a Hampton police officer, is also the stepson of Darrell Williams. I'm not kidding you. I know. What the hell? Way to go, South Carolina Highway Patrol Multidisciplinary Accident Investigation Team. At the time, the Murdaugh M.O. was not widely recognized. However, post-boat crash that took Mallory's life and the response from Randolph Murdaugh III and Alec and how they tried to control the narrative and deflect blame to Connor, suspicions began to surface about the Murdaugh involvement in the Stephen Smith death investigation. These suspicions triggered questions from various news outlets that started looking at the Murdaughs and any questionable deaths linking to them, which led to the Gloria Satterfield death, which led to uncovering the insurance scams, which led to the Maggie and Paul Murdaugh murders, which placed Alec Murdaugh at the center of suspicions and ultimately got him convicted of murder. Perhaps the Murdaughs thought this was the worst of things and they could move on, but it would not be that easy. A little older lady, now widowed from a financially disadvantaged circumstances, would not give up. She was Sandy Smith, Stephen Smith's mother, and when no one would listen to her, all the law enforcement agencies ignored her, and the PMPED law firm stopped accepting her phone calls, she was not discouraged. She started a letter-writing campaign and wrote the governor, the Department of Justice, and the FBI. But none of these agencies became involved until the local media, thanks to Fitz News, Will Folks, and the Murdaugh Murder podcast launched by Mandy Matney and Liz Farrell, that the story caught fire and people started looking at it closer. And it wasn't the local eyes, but outside eyes from other states and worldwide. South Carolina's law enforcement department came under scrutiny, and everyone was saying Stephen Smith's name. Way to go, Sandy. Russell Lafitte and Cousin Eddie. Suddenly, deception, thievery, selfishness, greed, and the sense of privileged entitlement became the new Murdaugh brand. Why, these people were nothing more than white pirates in corporate suits. The deep excavation into the Murdaugh history revealed this was a generationally acquired way of doing business. Murdaugh connections to bootleggers and drug smugglers were revealed. Mysterious deaths were associated with the Murdaughs. Going back to 2009, Hakeem Pinkney, whose ventilator was accidentally disconnected. 2015, Stephen Smith's unresolved death. 2018, Gloria Satterfield accidentally tripped by Murdaugh dogs. 2019, Mallory Beach accidentally drowned after a boat crash driven by Paul Murdaugh. 2021, Maggie and Paul Murdaugh murders. So the question remains, why did Randolph Murdaugh III, Randy Murdaugh IV insert themselves in the Stephen Smith death? Are Patrick Wilson and Sean Connolly being used as decoys? Now move forward to 2023. Alec is in prison, convicted of murdering Maggie, his wife, and Paul, his son. Stephen is dead, and the body has been exhumed. A second autopsy has been performed, and we are all waiting for the results. SLED announced it had 2 suspects. Turns out the 2 newly named suspects are Sean Connolly and Patrick Wilson. But both of these names were already on the report back in 2015. Although SLED said it is officially investigating this as a homicide, rumors circulate that they consider it might be a hit and run. Is anyone else confused? I thought there was no evidence on the road that another vehicle was involved. WTF is going on here? It sounds like we are back to what it was suspected to be in 2015. So why did it take 8 years? This saga keeps on perpetuating itself. It's crazy. Thank you so much for listening. I hope you enjoyed this segment. I want to let you know that I have already charted this case, and I know that a lot of you are not here for the astrological charts, so I'm probably going to split that section up and put it under its own playlist, or maybe even move it to my Patreon channel. And if anybody wants to see it, I'll give you the links, and you all can find all that information there. As always, I thank you so much for spending this little time with me. If you enjoyed this at all, I would appreciate it if you shared this video, gave me a thumbs up, and if you haven't done so, consider subscribing. I'll be posting more of these stories. Bye now.